Imagine waking up in the year 1900. The world feels certain, stable, like a giant machine that humans are finally learning how to control. Science is booming, industries thriving, railroads, electricity, medicine, all advancing at an unstoppable pace. People believe that with enough research we could figure out everything: how the universe works, how people behave, even how society functions. Truth, it seems, is like a puzzle waiting to be solved, and once we put all the pieces together, we'll have absolute certainty. This is the world of positivism, an era where truth was seen as fixed, universal, and just out there waiting to be discovered. A world where people had faith in reason, just as previous generations had faith in God. But by the end of the 20th century, truth would no longer be seen as a solid, objective reality, but as something shaped by human perception, culture, and power. This isn't just a story about philosophy or science, it's about how we see the world today. And in this video, I'm going to take you on a journey through one of the biggest intellectual revolutions of modern history. This positive way of thinking that I just described emerged during the Enlightenment when thinkers began challenging traditional sources of knowledge such as religion, superstition, and divine revelation, arguing that truth should be established through reason, observation, and empirical evidence. This revolution, or intellectual movement, laid the groundwork for positivism, which took these Enlightenment ideals further and proposed that all meaningful knowledge should come from sensory experience, that's empiricism. They thought if it can't be observed or measured, then it's not a valid source of truth. Second, that science is the best way to understand the world. That is, that human progress depends on applying the scientific method to all areas of life, including society and human behavior. They believed that metaphysics and religious speculation should be discarded because these cannot be tested or proven. And because they can't be tested or proven, then they're not considered valid forms of knowledge. That's the positive mindset. Truth is something we could prove through experiment and observation. And this approach shaped everything. And as we began to apply to humanity, the logic was simple. If we could figure out how atoms and stars work, then why can't we figure out how humans work? And this optimism led to huge advances in the tech sciences and in technology. But there's a darker side to that, in that it assumes that all knowledge has to fit into the scientific model. Anything that can't be measured, like emotions, spirituality, faith, God, those types of things were seen as less real. And that's when things started to fall apart. Because by the early 20th century, even science itself began undermining the very idea that reality was fixed and objective. Einstein's theory of relativity, for example, up to that point, people believed that space and time were the same for everyone. But Einstein showed that they're relative, they change depending on the observer's frame of reference. And this opposed the idea that there's one absolute reality that could be objectively measured. Then there's Gödel's incompleteness theorem that spoke about the limits of logic. He proved that there's some truths that maths can never prove. And this was huge because it meant that even logic, that's the foundations of rational thinking, even it had gaps. And then there's Freud. Sigmund Freud came along and he speculated upon the unconscious mind concerning subjectivity and perception. You know, have you ever reacted emotionally to something and later realized, oh, I was just tired, I was overreacting, or I was hungry? Well, Freud argued that much of human behavior is driven by unconscious forces, things that we don't even realize are influencing us. So this meant that people don't perceive reality as purely objective. Our emotions, fears, and experience filter what we believe to be true. So by the 1920s and the 1930s, the idea of a positive understanding of truth, that it was fixed, universal, and discoverable, was looking less and less certain. Then, as the 20th century progressed, philosophers and social scientists started asking bigger questions. They weren't just asking, can we discover the truth? But they were asking questions like, Who decides what truth is? And this coincided with a whole linguistic turn to reality, this understanding that language actually shapes reality. So imagine two people are arguing about what colour the sky is, and one speaks English and he calls it blue, and the other speaks a language that has no word for blue, only shades of dark and light. Are these two people seeing the sky differently? Ludwig Wittgenstein argued that words don't just describe reality, they shape how we experience it. Berger and Luckman, they wrote The Social Construction of Reality, and they taught us that how we think about things differs. For instance, imagine $100 bill. It's paper, but we all agree that it has value, even though it's paper. See, they argue that even knowledge works this way. It's not just discovered, it's created through social agreement. We've all come into agreement that that piece of paper, that $100 bill, has that value. Then there was the arrival of postmodernism and this whole idea of the death of the grand meta narrative. So, have you ever noticed how history books tell different versions of the same story? Michael Foucault, for instance, he argued that knowledge is always tied to power. Those in control of society define what truth is. Derrida took this even further and he argued that meaning is never fixed. Words and ideas can always be interpreted in multiple and different ways. So as things progressed throughout the 20th century, instead of seeing truth as something absolute, thinkers began to see it as something shaped by language, culture, and society. And even today, we see the effects of this shift. Science versus subjectivity in public discourse, so this whole debate over climate change. Scientific data says one thing, but political and ideological beliefs shape how people interpret it. Then remember a few years back to COVID-19 and the vaccines. Some trusted the scientific studies while others relied on alternative narratives shaped by social media, personal experience, or skepticism towards those institutions. Then there's gender and identity debates. Some argue that gender is biologically determined, while others claim it's socially constructed and fluid. Then there's conversations about race and privilege. Many people now recognize that racial identity and social power are shaped by historical and societal structures. And then we're coming towards what we're more interested in, is this whole idea of the shifts in theological and religious thought. Postmodern theology, for instance, that many theologians came along arguing that faith is interpreted through culture and historical context rather than an existing, single, objective truth. In the case of biblical hermeneutics, interpretations of scripture shifted, with scholars focusing more on how the texts were shaped by their cultural setting rather than assuming a purely universal and objective reading of the text. News and media polarization, we could go on and on concerning how society shifted towards away from understanding truth as something that's objective and can be positively determined to something that's relative and something that's out there, something that's constructed. The fact is, the way we understand truth affects everything, from religion to politics to how we see ourselves. And this shift is continuing. And as it's continuing, we've got to ask, what does it mean for theology today? And we've got to ask ourselves, what do I think it means for theology today? What do I think about truth? Is truth objective? Is it shaped by culture and experience? Is my understanding of God objective? Or is it shaped by my society and where I go to church? Is how I interpret the Bible? Is it objective? Is it being passed down for me in some sort of written codex that's infallible and inherent? Or is it open to interpretation by different people in different contexts and different times? So what do you think? Is truth objective? Or is it shaped by culture and experience? Drop a comment below, and don't forget to continue watching this video series on the difference between contextual theology and practical theology.